All right, well, welcome everybody to our weekly Wednesday webinar series. And then real quick, big thanks to our top tier sponsor, Srinergy. The solar generator is the most powerful solar generator, yet still only weighs 20 pounds, capable of satisfying the demanding needs of camp trailers and home appliances for days at a time. This generator is versatile as it is powerful. For the ultimate in emergency power or camping luxury without the hassle of traditional fuel-powered generators. The kit comes with all solar panel cables you need to get started, plus a wall charger. Connect the Solar Storm 100 panel and fully recharge the solar generators in 15 hours in ideal sunlight. Here's just some of the different charge times, depending on how many panels you have. If you go direct into a wall plug, 4 to 8 hours, and if you're on the go and don't have solar access, 4 to 6 hours in the system. And then again, here is just some of the longevity of the on-the-go battery system. Or you can use it during grid outages at your house or small businesses, up to 33 hours on an 18 cubic foot Energy Star certified refrigerator, and up to over 100 recharges on a 5 to 7 watt efficient smartphone, to name a few. Srinergy, with years of experience in renewable industry, has developed also a solar microgrid kit with lithium-ion based battery storage for the U.S., Caribbean, Central, and South American market, based on the highest quality PV panels and hybrid inverter technology available in the industry. Their kit provides rugged durability, long life, and reliable performance day in and day out for electricity. And so make sure to check that out. And then if you're in the state of Michigan and you're on some of these muni utility grids, Srinergy is working with those with 1 acre or more to help finance and get some solar projects launched. So make sure to check them out at srinergy.com. Well, welcome to the Ongoing Electrification Future Studies, EFS. This course is approved for 1 hour continuing education units, GBCI, AIBD, NARI Green, BPI, NonWholeHouse, to name a few, as well as American Institute of Architects, AIA, Health, Welfare, and Safety, which may make it applicable for your state-based design or contractor license. Today, I will be your moderator. My name is Brett Little, and I am the executive director here at the nonprofit, the Green Home Institute. The hashtag Electrify Everything movement is well underway. We're seeing more and more projects and developments go all electric for reasons such as eliminating the cost of piping, venting, maybe because of higher gas bills, maybe because of being disconnected from the local grid, all the way to right-sizing the HVAC equipment. All those are reasons that this is happening. But what are the barriers that do exist for all economic sectors for electrification? That's really what we're going to be discussing here today. So Daniel Steinberg, he is a senior researcher and manager of the Economics and Forecasting Group at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL. His expertise in policy design and impact analysis, energy systems modeling, and ecometrics. His current research spans a broad range of topics, including clean energy policy and the associated implications for the evolution of the power sector, electrification of end-use sectors, and renewable grid integration. Prior to joining NREL, he worked as a researcher at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, Woods Hole Research Center, and the Marine Biological Laboratory. He has a bachelor's in Earth and Atmospheric Science from Cornell and a master's in Environmental Economics from Yale University. So with that, Daniel, please take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Brett. Thanks for the introduction. Pleasure to be here today. There we are. Show my screen. And Brett, I'm going to hide all my controls here. So if there are any clarifying questions that come up, please just flag those for me. Is everybody seeing the screen all right? Or Brett, can you see the screen?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Great. Okay. Right. So as Brett said, I'm going to talk a little bit about an ongoing study that we have called the Electrification Future Study. A very big study, multi-year, multi-institution, covering a lot of different ground. So today I'll give an overview and sort of the motivation for why we're carrying out this analysis. And then I'll get into sort of the existing published results that we have, and these are on end-use technology projections. So these are how we're projecting certain types of key sort of electric technologies to evolve from present day into the future. So this is both the efficiency of those technologies as well as their cost. I'll also cover the demand side scenarios of this project, which basically looks at how is the adoption of different types of technologies changing over time across all end-use sectors, residential and commercial buildings, vehicles, and industry, and how those changes in adoption are ultimately changing our energy sector from a demand perspective. And then I'll talk a little bit more at the end about where we're at in the study and what you can expect to come. Okay, so this slide is sort of a general slide, and what it shows is for a sample of countries around the world, how has the final energy share made up by electricity evolved over the past 35 years or so. So this is final energy. So what final energy is? The energy that's consumed at the point of end use. So this is the fuel that goes into your car, natural gas in your furnace, the electricity that your computers are consuming probably currently. So what this is really showing is that almost uniformly across the sample, more and more humans around the entire world are relying on electricity to fuel our end-use services. So this is heating, this is lighting, transportation, cooking. It certainly isn't uniform across all countries. Obviously, Nigeria is a good example here, where there are probably other barriers to electrification. But all in all, the world is electrifying more and more. I argue that the reason for this is that electricity is a pretty terrific fuel. Once you've invested in transmission infrastructure, you can move it from point A to point B almost instantaneously, specifically at around 3/4 the speed of light. It's highly flexible and controllable, so it can be used for all sorts of applications, HVAC applications, running small home appliances, running your electric vehicle. Another industrial application here shown is an electric arc furnace. It has 0 point of use emissions. Of course, this doesn't mean that there's no emissions associated with electricity. There are certainly substantial emissions associated with electricity in the U.S. upstream, but there's no point of use emissions. And that means that sort of raises opportunities to control those emissions upstream from the point of use. They're at large concentrated sources, which means you have options to either substitute those sources for low emitting or zero emitting generation, or to potentially directly control them through capture and storage. And then finally, although historically electricity has been relatively expensive to store and required large capital investments in things like pumped hydro storage, we're seeing precipitous drops in the cost of battery manufacturing. And so the storability of electricity, which is historically one of the biggest challenges with electricity, is starting to become much more feasible and much more cost effective. Despite this, in the U.S., we've actually seen a slowing in the amount of electricity consumed, and this is all the while population, GDP, and total end-use service consumption has changed. This is happening for a number of complex reasons: changes in the structure of the economy, changes in the efficiency of end-use devices. So we're going to less energy-intensive economic sectors, service sectors, for instance. Efficiency of end-use devices is going up, and even things like heat pumps are becoming more and more efficient. And then there's other pieces like we had an economic recession that had a huge impact on electricity consumption. But we're seeing that greater electrification may be on the rise, and this is a result of fundamental changes in the end-use devices that provide services that we demand. And these are transportation, these are space heating and water heating services, these are industrial services. And because of improvements in those technologies and the potential advantages they offer, we're expecting to see a fair amount of electrification solely from sort of an economic perspective. On top of it, there are other drivers for electrification. Some cities, states, and countries are pushing for electrification through policies and incentive support for both environmental reasons as well as energy security reasons. And then certainly electric utilities have a keen eye on electrification. In some cases are supporting it, although for some utilities it means trade-offs between gas sales and electricity sales. For those that are electric focused, this obviously presents a potential business option. So given that we may be seeing a lot of electrification in the US, we basically want to understand from a power system planning perspective, how are we going to plan for electrification? And so we've kicked off the Electrification Future Studies. This is a multi-year, multi-institution study. I'll cover some of that a little bit more later on. But basically, we're trying to answer five key questions with this study. First what are the key electric technologies that are available now? So not things that haven't been invented yet, but key technologies that are available now that can enable electrification or switching from an incumbent fossil fuel device to an electric fuel device. And how will those technologies advance over time? So what are those key technologies? And secondly, how are demand or adoption patterns for those technologies going to change through time, and how is that going to ultimately impact load patterns? So this is not just total annual increase in electricity consumption, but how do diurnal load shapes change? How do seasonal load shapes change? And then given those changes in electricity load or demand for electricity, how does the supply side of the power system need to evolve to meet those changes in load? So if we're seeing much peakier demand associated with, workplace charging of electric vehicles, how is that ultimately how is that need going to be served by the supply side? Fourth, how might demand side flexibility, so this is demand response, help support that transition to this electrified future? And then finally, what are the impacts of a potential electrified future? So we're basically trying to look at what are potential scenarios of electrification going forward. What does that look like in terms of adoption of different types of technologies? How is that impacting load? And how is the power system going to evolve to meet those changes? And what are the impacts? So as I said, this is a multi-institution study led here at NREL, but we have partners at the Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI, working with a consultant called Evolved Energy Research, participants from Northern Arizona University, as well as a number of other national labs, and our key sponsor, the U.S. Department of Energy. So we're about halfway, a little over halfway now through this study. We've released a number of reports. The first one on technology cost and performance projections. I'll cover that today. The demand side adoption scenarios and the impacts on total electricity consumption. I'll also cover that. We've also released some documentation on a model that was partly developed for this study called the dsgrid model, which is a bottom-up load model for all sectors, and really is sort of a wrapper that pulls together a number of bottom-up engineering models of load, both for residential and commercial buildings, industry, as well as transportation. We're working on the final report for the supply side evolution right now. That should be coming out in the next few months or so. And that really looks at how is the power sector evolving to meet these changes of load, and how might the power sector evolve differently under different conditions, such as policy or fuel price conditions. Ultimately, we'll also do some very detailed work on the supply side. So this is sort of the evolution, what's invested in, what types of technologies are invested in within the supply side, and how do we meet load out to 2050. But then we'll also say, at a very detailed level from the power system perspective, how is the system dispatching under these alternative load shapes? And then we plan to release another report on the sort of economy-wide impacts of electrification. Okay, so now let me dive into some of the current set of results. So the first set of things I'm going to cover here are the technology cost and performance data report. So when we started this study, one of the big challenges was that there weren't a lot of projections out there for how things like air source heat pumps are going to evolve from present day out into the future. There's a lot of work done on those technologies by the DOE Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, their standards program. but that was really most of what had been done on looking at potential projections of changes in the efficiency and installed costs of these devices, and it wasn't comprehensive enough for us to do a lot of modeling with. So we set out to develop a new set of projections for a whole set of technologies in buildings, transportation, and some in industry as well. So in buildings, we really focused on air source heat pumps, including cold climate air source heat pumps and then heat pump water heaters. As we saw, those are the largest opportunities for electrification in the building sector. Cooking was also something that we looked at, but we felt like there was already a pretty good representation of induction-based cooking. We looked at both light and heavy-duty applications in the transportation sector, and we looked a little bit more qualitatively at the industrial sector. In terms of electrification and total understanding of opportunities, industry is sort of one of the more challenging sectors to tackle. So a quick look at what we've done here. So again, I said we were developing basically projections of the installed cost, what it actually takes to get a piece of this equipment on average into a home or into a commercial building in the US, and then how with additional R&D, research and development on the technologies might the efficiency change and the cost come down. So we used a variety of sources of data from this, collected sort of input from a lot of experts in the field, and then compiled data both from sort of existing models and projections, standard sources, and then just sort of the open literature. And so you can see on that left side both the cost and the performance projections there, and ultimately the competitiveness of these technologies relative to incumbent technologies will depend on the combination of both these things, because that will lead to a certain levelized cost of service. So in addition to developing those key projections, we sort of integrate those into a levelized cost of service over the lifetime of the technology and examine how they stack up relative to some incumbent sources. So if we look at residential space heating here, we compare kind of a reference gas furnace to a high efficiency gas furnace to electric resistance heating, and to that air source heat pumps and cold climate air source heat pumps. And basically what we're finding is even in as soon as 2020, that these technologies are close to being competitive. And so with relatively small changes in their cost and performance, they will likely be adopted, certainly in some climate zones in the US and by some populations. So as I said, so that was the first effort to develop this sort of fundamental data on how these technologies are going to evolve. Then the second effort is developing projections of how our customers actually ultimately going to adopt these based on some of those performance attributes and under different scenarios where we sort of think about different potential regimes for electrification. So policy support, changes in electricity rate structures that might incentivize electrification, et cetera. So overall, the objective here is characterize changes to end-use sectors with increasing level of electrification, and really understand how electrification is going to impact total electricity demand and overall consumption profiles. As I mentioned, the scenarios for adoption that we developed are based on some on expert judgment, some on just data collection, compiling information from other projections. We did do some consumer choice modeling, so these are actually models that are simulating human behavior on adoption of devices. The best of those models apply to the vehicle sector, so there's not as much in buildings. And then using those adoption projections, we then use stock accounting models that turn over the existing stock of devices, and then based on the sales shares that we sort of exogenously decide, turn over that stock over time. So in terms of the adoption projections, all of our projections sort of follow a sort of typical back diffusion or S-curve shape adoption, where there's an invention of a new technology, there's then innovation in that technology, and sort of a niche market will adopt it, a small portion of the market. But then when the value of that technology is shown, it becomes much more pervasive, is adopted by a wide range of the market, and then it ultimately saturates. And then for some technologies, as it's replaced by another technology. So a little bit more detail on this approach. So again, first we're developing projections of sales shares. So this is anytime a furnace dies, what percentage of a population or of homes in an existing climate zone are going to adopt a heat pump over a furnace or a heat pump over electric resistance heating. So those are the sales shares, and those are specified in the building sector by climate, in the vehicle sector more by census division. So those give us the sales shares. From that, we can understand how many, the stock of different devices. So again, how many heat pumps versus other types of heating systems are installed in buildings. And from that, we can then determine the total amount of end-use service that's served with different types of technologies and with different fuels. So for these adoption scenarios, we developed 4, but focused on 3 different scenarios. One is a reference, which has the least incremental change, and this follows the Energy Information Administration, the EIA's annual energy outlook, which is a projection from the Energy Information Administration of sort of business as usual behavior from present day out to 2050. So this is pretty much in line with that scenario and has relatively little change in the penetration of sort of electro technologies or electric technologies that couldn't replace incumbent fossil technologies. My own sort of personal impression of this scenario, the reference scenario, is it's probably underestimating the amount of electrification that we had, but it is a very widely used scenario in the energy sector, and so it was a good choice for us to match that. The medium scenario is then widespread electrification across the lower hanging fruit opportunities in the electrification space. So this is things like electrifying space heating in buildings and electrifying light duty vehicle transportation, but not electrifying heavy duty vehicle transportation. There's a lot more barriers to heavy duty, particularly long haul trucking for electrification. So none of that is happening in the medium scenario. It's just the sort of the stuff that most people are more used to thinking about. And then finally, the high scenario is much more transformational. And these are electrifying end uses that really wouldn't occur without some other driver or support for that adoption. Okay, so I wanted to dive in a little bit more deeply into the building sector results, obviously for this audience. So probably something that's not a surprise to all of you is that the building sector is the most electrified of all sectors. Electricity makes up 43% of final energy, and this is because things like air conditioning are entirely electricity, refrigeration is entirely electric. So the remaining end uses where there's opportunity for electrification are in these purple bars here. So spice heating, water heating, other. Some of that other are things like grills outside, and cooking in the residential case is actually under the other. Here, lawnmowers and things like that are fueled with gasoline, and pretty much the same for commercial buildings, space heating and water heating. Cooking makes up a bigger portion there because of all the commercial applications for cooking. So despite the fact that it's highly electrified, there's still huge opportunity for electrification within the building sector, but focused on the space heating, water cooling here, and so that's what we ultimately focused on in the building sector. A little look at air source heat pumps today. So there's actually a fairly high penetration of air source heat pumps. That's probably not a surprise to you all. It is concentrated in certain regions, places like the Southeast. Heat pumps are going in, or in fact taking, I think, the majority of the market share, at least in new construction these days. If I remember correctly, it's something like 80% of new homes in the Southeast are installing heat pumps over other types of services. So yes, so the distribution is highly concentrated in these mild and warm climates, but we are starting to see penetration in colder climates as well as cold climate heat pumps become more efficient. So what do these scenarios look like in the air source heat pumps? Again, the reference case is sort of tied to the AEO, but basically we're finding that scenario shows air source heat pumps increasing in adoption, but minimally. Sales share reaches approximately 20% and 12% in the residential commercial sectors by 2050. So not much change from current conditions. The medium case changes quite a bit. So here in climates that are more conducive to these technologies, we're seeing we're modeling 80% adoption, 30% in cold climates. You might ask, is that really realistic for cold climates? And I think my answer is yes. As I said before, we're seeing increased adoption in these cold climates. In some cases as a single technology for a home or a building, but in other cases to sort of supplement or offset relatively expensive incumbent forms of heating. So places like the Northeast, where there's still a high penetration of fuel oil heating. Fuel oil is very expensive and inconvenient to refill tanks with. And so we've seen a lot of evidence that folks are adding mini splits and things like that to their homes to just offset the heating bill. And then finally, under the high case, the sort of transformational case, adoption approaches 100% of sales shares in 2050 in sort of the opportune regions in the U.S. And then we're assuming that some breakthroughs in cold climate heat pumps that allow them to operate at high efficiency at temperatures below freezing allow increased adoption in cold regions, and then even some adoption in very cold regions in places like northern Minnesota and Maine. Right, so a quick look at building sector results here. So what we find is given these, under the high scenario, we're finding that up to 61% of space heating, 52% of water heating, and 94% of cooking services could be served with electrified devices. So we're offsetting quite a bit of the existing fuel consumption in the building sector. Of course, this would require sort of dramatic change in appliance manufacturing and installation, where we are installing, hundreds of thousands, millions of devices in this case. And so we'd actually have to be manufacturing a lot more of these appliances and building up the trade sectors to actually have knowledge to install them and to retrofit homes to achieve these penetrations. So overall, like some of the key questions that we sort of arrived at after doing all this work were, will cold climate heat pumps actually achieve enough advancement to be sufficient to enable widespread adoption? So cold climate heat pumps there's actively being researched. DOE's investing a lot of research and development funds into them. And there's a lot of promising new technologies, things like adsorption technologies that could have the potential to drastically increase their performance and ultimately drive down their all-in costs. If this doesn't happen, if they're not successful, it's unlikely that we'll see widespread adoption in colder regions. Secondly, will new technology facilitate electrification in retrofits and new buildings? So, there's an obvious barrier to the existing building stock. You have, services set up for certain types of devices, and changing from gas to electric can be relatively costly and intrusive to a building owner. And therefore, are there sort of options for technologies that will make retrofits easier? And this will have a huge impact on the potential for adoption. Third, how might challenges to building electrification be overcome? So these are things like cultural acceptance, familiarity, landlord-tenant issues. Landlord-tenant issues are things like the owner of the building does not have the incentive to replace a device, even if there are cost and energy savings associated with it. So how are we going to overcome these things? How are we going to get more acceptance amongst folks that are installing these, that are building new buildings, et cetera? And then finally, what are the potential sort of secondary value streams for these? If we're creating a lot of new load for electricity, are these things going to be grid connected? Are they going to be able to provide demand response services and ultimately extract some value in the help that they provide to balance the grid and sort of relieve distribution system stress? Okay, so I wanted to touch briefly on transportation and industry before sort of looking at overall results. So I think one of the biggest takeaways from our look at the transportation sector is that there's huge opportunities in the transportation sector. Unlike buildings, the transportation sector is relatively unelectrified. It's less than 1% of final energy in the transportation sector is electricity now. Basically, everything uses gasoline or diesel. Light-duty plug-in electric cars and trucks have the biggest opportunity for electrification across all scenarios. Electric trucks could play a major role, but that is going to be a pretty substantial challenge, particularly for long-haul applications. Short-haul applications where you don't need as much energy stored in a battery are easier, or there are opportunities for things like overhead catenary infrastructure, like we used to use on old trolleys, that could mitigate sort of short-haul applications like garbage trucks and buses around town and things like that. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip this. So key questions for the transportation sector. First and foremost, it's what's going to happen with batteries. Batteries are one of the biggest costs for an electric vehicle, and if those continue to decline and performance improves, we're likely to see rapid adoption of these technologies. You know, we're already seeing exponential growth in the adoption of electric technologies, but as those costs come down and they get more competitive with incumbent low-cost vehicles, we could see much more rapid adoption. Consumer preference is key here. So barriers to adoption still include things like range anxiety that are keeping folks that, you know, want to drive 250 miles or 350 miles without charging a vehicle. Some electric vehicles are able to do that today, but you have to pay a price premium to be able to store that amount of energy, and therefore any sort of mitigation of that will help improve things. At the same time, there are things like electric vehicles accelerate very quickly because they have 100% of their torque without having to spin up an internal combustion engine. And so there are certain benefits to electrification that are really driving at least a substantial portion of the population to adopt today. The third is electric vehicle charging infrastructure. This is sort of the chicken or the egg thing. Is the electric vehicle infrastructure going to evolve to meet demand for electric vehicles, or is vehicle charging infrastructure going to evolve first and then folks will adopt? And so how those two things interact could impact electrification tremendously. And then finally, there are these questions about what is the actual personal transportation industry going to look like in the future? Are we going to have a substantial change in ownership models? Are things like autonomous vehicles going to just completely revolutionize the vehicle sector, where you have a single owner of a large fleet of vehicles? Whenever you want to go somewhere, an electric vehicle shows up at your house, takes you where it wants to go, and therefore the fleet can be optimized as to when and where it's charging. And that can have huge impacts also, not just for the adoption of electric vehicles, but how that interacts with the supply side, the grid side. Industrial sector. So one of the big things that we took away from the industrial sector is the industrial sector is hard. It's a sort of much more fits and starts in terms of adoption. It doesn't have this constant fluidity in terms of change of devices. And this is largely driven by the fact that, you know, new technologies are developed for industrial applications, and if they have a benefit either in production or cost over incumbent technologies, they very rapidly spread across the industry because it's kind of a do or die situation for any manufacturer, for instance. And so we saw a lot of electrification up until sort of the late 20th century, but then it's been relatively flat since then. And so it's pretty hard to create sort of generalizations across this industry because it's this sort of fits and starts kind of movement here. And there's a lot of data that we really need to do this better. So we're really focused on industrial process heating, and it's basically just creating heat for various types of manufacturing processes. A lot of industrial process heating can be converted, but there are certain high temperature applications that can be challenging to convert. And so we found sort of lower opportunities currently for industrial electrification, but there could be bigger opportunities going forward as those technologies continue to evolve. sort of touched on this, but not exactly. So one of the key questions here was not just what are the cost implications of electric technologies for industry, but the productivity benefits. And so in some cases, they're actually increased costs of an electric technology. For instance, infrared curing or drying of a product rather than using direct process heat from a furnace. But there are opportunities to increase production. So, 5% energy savings aren't a big deal to a manufacturer when their energy bill only makes up, 2% of their total cost. But if you can increase their production flow by 1%, they're very much likely to adopt that technology. So how these electric technologies sort of revolutionize these manufacturing chains is likely more important than sort of the energy consumption impact for an individual adopter. I touched on this. Can electric technologies really meet the needs for high temperature applications in industry? This is a big question out there that a lot of folks are working on. And then finally, what's the interplay with the long equipment lifetimes and manufacturer profit-driven decisions? So you have a whole supply chain or a manufacturing chain of equipment. It's a relatively big endeavor to replace a component of that, and replacing a component might mean a lot of upstream and downstream changes as well. And so it can mean downtimes for your business, and so a big decision overall. Okay, so getting to the big picture, what do we find here? So this shows both the historical load broken out by sector here. One of the things that you see over history is that transportation doesn't show up there, right? It's all red, orange, and green, which are industry, residential buildings, and commercial buildings. Under electrified futures, we see that the predominant amount of the growth opportunity is in electrification of transportation. Again, that's because it is not an electrified sector right now. And so if we electrify half of it or even a quarter of it, it means a huge growth in electricity consumption. Although we are electrifying a lot in commercial and residential buildings, the overall impact on electricity consumption is relatively minor. Part of this is because you're replacing a technology like a furnace or a boiler, which might have a 95% efficiency, with a heat pump that has a 300% efficiency. And so although you are going from gas to electricity, the total energy content that you're using is much less. And so the efficiency sort of trade-offs really keep the growth in electricity consumption from being large in that building sector. Another observation a lot of folks make is that, wow, this is a huge increase in total electricity consumption by 2050. We're looking at 1.6% compound annual growth from present day out into the future. And that is huge relative to very recent trends, trends in the 2000s. But back from the 1950s on, this was actually a relatively constant rate of growth. In fact, we saw some rates of growth of 3% over the mid part of the 20th century. And so, in some sense, getting on an electrified future path is more sort of like a back to the future sort of situation where we're getting back to this world where the power sector is growing very rapidly to meet these increased needs. Despite the fact that buildings don't have a huge impact on the overall annual level of demand, they do have a big impact on when the demand is happening. So there are two charts here. It's a little bit complicated showing. So focusing on the left, this is a snapshot of 2015. The circles show the percent or the portion of the hours, of the peak hours, the top 100 hours that fall within each season. And as you can see, with the exception of the Pacific Northwest, where there's already a high penetration of electric heating, most of the regions are characterized by a summer peak. But as you install a lot more air source heat pumps, electric heating, we see winter peaking regions in the Northeast and a lot more hours, high load hours in winters in the Southeast and kind of pervasively across the U.S. So this is really important for the power sector supply side. Because this means that there are these other peaks throughout the year that the power sector needs to contend with. There's the variability in load and the total peak and load, and we need to be able to meet those needs going forward. What does our study look like, overall with a range of other electrification work that's been done. So we have some examples here from Energy Information Administration, Electric Power Research Institute, Williams et al. Is by E3, which is a consulting company. The White House did some work on this through the Department of Energy. Jürgen Weiss at Brattle, and then Steinberg et al. is me, who I did a technical potential that was much less economically informed prior to this bigger study. But overall, we're sort of coming into the same range of opportunity here as identified across these other studies. And so the point here is that there seems to be sort of this band of sort of conclusion where there's a certain amount of electricity consumption associated with electrification that the research industry is really sort of landing on, and so we're right in the mix there. Overall, electricity share of final energy doubles from 2016 to 2050. So this is going back to that early trend that I showed, electrification across many countries. But this would sort of get us on that same trajectory where we are relying much more on electricity to fuel our end-use services. What does that mean for consumption of fuels? That means huge drops in the consumption of gasoline. Again, transportation is not electrified at all, so any electrification means large offsets of gasoline consumed. Lesser amounts of diesel consumed, and this is because it's harder to electrify heavy-duty applications in the vehicle sector, and then substantial decrease in natural gas, which is largely driven by buildings. So it's a 37% decrease in natural gas under the high scenario due to offset heating needs for both space heating and water heating. So that's sort of where we're at in the project currently. As I said, we actually did release this report, which goes through this model that we developed for this. But I think more importantly, the next piece that we're going to be releasing is the supply side evolution scenarios. And so we've seen all these changes in both total quantity of electricity demand associated with electrification, as well as change in load patterns. And so now we're simulating how is the power sector going to evolve to meet those that dynamic change in load. And as I said, so that report should be coming out later this year. We're in active review of that report right now. And then going forward, it's unclear whether we're going to have a separate report on the impacts of electrification, whether we're going to sort of bring that into the supply side evolution. But we'll see this year both supply side impacts as well as sort of broader economy-wide impacts of electrification. And then finally, we'll be doing some detailed work on sort of power system operational questions that are much more detailed, hourly unit commitment and dispatch modeling, 5-minute dispatch modeling, et cetera, which is probably less interest to this audience, but nevertheless, we'll be releasing that as well. So that's all I had, and happy to open it up for discussion now. I did want to acknowledge my colleagues working on this, True Mai, who's leading this overall effort, Paige Jaden, who's done a lot of work on transportation, Jeff, who worked with me on buildings, Colin on industry, Mateo also on transportation, and a number of others with a number of other commitments. So thank you, and happy to open it up here.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Danielle. We do have some time for questions here, and real quick as those questions are rolling in, let me just real quick here, for those of you watching this session, take the survey that pops up when we close out here at the end or gets sent to you in your email. For those of you watching this in the future on demand, the recording, get that 80% passing rate. The quiz, GHI members can take that on YouTube, and then US GBC viewers can follow their specific instructions. As far as YouTube, head to the YouTube channel when the video pops up down there at the bottom, and then from there on the left, go to the Show Me More to expand the description section, and then from there you'll see details about the quiz and a sort of short link to get you into that quiz and be able to submit for your Con Ed. And a huge thanks, before we get to those questions, I see a few coming in here, and before we get to those questions, a huge thanks to our top tier sponsors, Srinergy for on-the-go or backup systems for your office or home for not if, but when the grid goes down. Mitsubishi all-electric systems, air source heat pumps to help get to net zero even in the coldest of climates for all building types, new and existing. And then T-stud, structurally insulated framing systems that save money and energy behind the walls. All right, so let's check those questions here. Are projects in an increase of extreme weather events factored into these projections? So for example, hot summers, colder winters?
The answer is no. So the answer is no. We'd like to, but obviously we had to draw the boundary somewhere. We have done a fair amount of work, particularly on the power system supply side of looking at impacts of potential climate change effects on the power sector. And incorporating that, we simulate changes in demand associated with increased heating degree days and decreased cooling degree, increased cooling degree days and decreased heating degree days and things like that. But in this particular set, we don't assume that. Yeah. Other questions?
I was talking on mute there. So considering that one of the big reasons for going electric is reducing emissions, and that and this person is referencing drawdowns. If you haven't checked that out, go check that out. But they list in drawdown, one of the top things is refrigerant management for reducing emissions. So the question is, can you address the question of refrigerant potential increase if widespread adoption of, let's say cold climate air source heat pumps are achieved?
Yeah, so this is not something I've looked into in detail, but I think that's completely valid. There's a lot of work ongoing, not at the DOE, but funded by the DOE at some of the other labs that work more explicitly, sort of experimentally on these end-use technologies that are looking at alternative refrigerants, CO2-based heat pumps, and things like that. So there's a lot of interest in the, basically improving on those refrigerant emissions, particularly given that they're such high, they have such high greenhouse gas impact relative to CO2 or other emissions. That's not something that we plan to capture here, but it is certainly something of high interest to us and to DOE, and that there's a lot of ongoing work on that, and I can potentially point you to some of the materials on that if of interest.
Great, thank you. What are your thoughts on how natural gas oriented suppliers will transition and write down or I guess ramp down their existing infrastructure?
I think that's a really good question, and I don't have a particularly good answer for it. We have a whole sort of technical review committee for this work, and that includes fossil producers and utilities and things like that. So we're getting input from them. But I think that's one of the big questions that we, the sort of business model questions we don't plan to answer. That would be another study, but we will certainly be estimating the impacts on total fuel sales. The other thing that we are seeing so far in the supply side scenarios that we haven't published yet, but is that we see increased usage of natural gas in the power sector. There are price dynamics in play here, so the decreased usage in the end-use sectors has a downward impact on prices in other sectors, being the power sector, and so that becomes an even more attractive fuel to use for generation. And so in some sense, there is some real feedback where, okay, you're not using gas in the end-use sectors, but you're using it now more in the power sector. And so in terms of the total impact on emissions and total fuel usage, it'll ultimately be, how basically what are the substitution elasticities there. But, it's probably not going to be a one-to-one shift, but it 0.1 or is it 0.5 or whatever it is will ultimately determine those total impacts.
Great. So just thinking about where I guess your local grid energy is coming from in the mix of it, did you look at what the COP of the heat pump needs to be to make it an environmental benefit or a wash?
Yeah, that's also a great question. I guess the one thing that I'd note. So answering the question, no, we didn't do break-even calculations, for each state. That's certainly something that would be relatively easy to do, but for whatever reason we haven't done it. One thing to keep in mind is because you have such a huge increase in efficiency gain, you can still be relatively emitting on the upstream generation side and still have an overall emissions benefit by switching from, particularly when you're talking about things like oil to electric. So overall, you can sort of think of the power sector as somewhere around 40%, 50% efficient in terms of primary energy to final energy. And so, if you have a 300% efficient heat pump, then you have a net benefit there. It depends on, the fuels that you're talking about and the fuel mix of the generation in the region. But, overall, you can make a pretty good case, I think, across the board for those electric technologies. But certainly in some regions where you have a heavily emitting generation sector and you're offsetting natural gas on the end use side, you may not have a net benefit.
How do decentralized or distributed smaller grid systems come into play in the studies?
So I guess I guess it hasn't been a question exactly that we're tackling. I don't know if the audience member has a little bit more on that question. On the power system side, the simulation models that we leverage kind of are focused on sort of bulk system, the three different interconnections in the U.S., the Western Interconnection, the Eastern Interconnection, and ERCOT, Texas, basically. So we haven't put a lot of thought into like microgrids, if that's the question. I think they're in regions that are trying to establish microgrids or places like military bases that have existing small grids. These technologies, I think, could potentially help or hurt in terms of balancing those grids if they're very flexible. So if they're built with substantial controls to be able to sort of optimize when they're operating, so pre-cooling and preheating and things like that, then they can certainly be used to help integrate other resources, be them renewable or not. But if they're very inflexible, it could create challenges because, if you're in a cold climate region and it's a super cold day and you have a heat pump and you have to switch to that resistance-based backup, you're going to have a big spike in the middle or in the evening to heat up a building. So, potential trade-offs. I'm not sure if that got to the question or not. But.
Thank you. Any thoughts on blockchain factoring in vehicle to grid or vehicle or to distributed grids, really?
Yeah, certainly, any sort of innovation that can help do energy transactions and track them at the micro level will, I think, incentivize electrification because it'll allow all the resources connected to the grid, be they dedicated supply resources or demand and supply resources, it will help all use those resources efficiently, basically, right? You'll be able to, when your car is at home, plugged into a charger, it's hooked up to some computer somewhere that is saying, okay, I need to draw a little bit off the car battery. It has no impact on you necessarily if it's managed well, and it can provide those services and you can recoup the value for those services. So any of those innovations to help integrate demand side and supply side technologies, I think will have a positive effect on electrification.
So here's a comment into a question. I'm surprised to see that in the Northeast, the winter season has the most peak load days, and cold Minnesota sees mostly summer days. Are they using heat pumps significantly more in the Northeast versus Minnesota, or are these electric resistance more for heating?
Let me see if I captured on all that. I'm just going to go back to the slide. Okay, so you're seeing, right. So, you know, I have a hypothesis on that question, but I'm not entirely sure. I think I need to go back and look at the adoption shares in Minnesota versus the Northeast. And it may not be representative of like whether or not demand is really increasing drastically in Minnesota, but that the cooling needs in Minnesota are higher potentially, or for whatever reason, you know, the sum of total loads in the upper Midwest there fall in summer. I mean, this is not the slide that I showed is not just the buildings load, but is across the board here. So it could have something to do with vehicles, who knows? But I have to go back and look at those shares. So whoever the audience member was, you know, if you want to follow up with me on that question offline, I can try to track that down.
And just some question. I mean, just some thoughts in your research. Did it factor in, you know, tighter building envelopes, more energy efficiency? I mean, does that play a role into faster adoption?
It does, but we didn't vary that drastically across scenarios. Associated with the reference scenario is an increase in building envelope efficiency, but we didn't vary that hugely across these scenarios. What we did do is run a whole separate matrix of scenarios that it didn't show, where we assume different performance characteristics of the electro technologies. So in buildings, these are the heat pumps for both space and water heating. And the idea there is to say, if we see sort of the same level of adoption, but different performance characteristics, what does that mean in terms of load shapes overall? Our group, folks leading this study, really are focused more on the power sector supply side and the implications there. Obviously, we've done a lot on the demand side as well, but those load shapes have really strong implications for the types of resources that you need to meet load. So we really want to resolve that. So if we don't see any efficiency improvements in heat pumps versus a lot of efficiency improvements, that's going to have a big impact.
Got it. And then there's a lot of questions kind of pouring in here on solar power. So I'll just sort of tie them all together and, you know, just, you know, does your study, or are you looking to account for, you know, local solar sort of, you know, shaving off the demand on site before it, you know, goes to the grid?
Yep. So the answer is yes. So yeah, I mean, one of the main things my group does is sort of power sector scenario analysis and kind of projections. The way that we tackle that is we actually have separate models for the bulk system versus the distributed system. The distributed system model is a suite of models that can kind of run together now, called the distributed generation suite, the DGen suite. And on the bulk system side, our approach is really sort of an economic optimizing agent that's investing in the power sector, that's sort of weighing the impacts of environmental policy and physical requirements of the grid, and coming up with a set of resources to meet load at lowest cost. On the distributed side, it's a much different type of model. It's a consumer adoption model, so it's much more behaviorally informed, and each individual customer there is sort of acting as an individual actor, and he or she has a certain set of sort of preferences for different payback periods and things like that. And so we basically simulate that as an individual adopter making a decision about whether or not to put a solar system on his or her house, or to put a solar system on their commercial building. And that has the impact of sort of reducing total load that actually hits the bulk system side. And the load that those consumers are seeing within the DGen suite is the load that we are creating through these scenarios. So I guess to wrap it all up, so we're creating these load scenarios. The customers are making decisions for adoption based on their projected load and electricity price projections. That's then altering the load that the bulk system sees.
Great, great. Well, we're at our time here, and I don't see any other questions. I think we had some great conversation. So just real quick, where can people go to contact you or find out information or read the study if they'd like?
So if you have the slides back on slide 1, maybe, where was it? Yeah, back on slide 1, the NREL.gov/EFS, or backslash rather, / whatever that is, NREL.gov/EFS. And then, yeah, I'm easy to find. I'm on the web. Go to NREL, just search NREL and Dan Steinberg, and you'll find me. So feel free to reach out. There's a lot of information on that website, including all our current publications. There might be even some additional webinars. So dig in there, and then the team here, happy to hear your questions.
And actually, right before we wrap up, one other question came in, and I think the answer is just about what's fueling the extra demand for electricity, and I assume that's going to be within your upcoming supply side study, correct?
What's fueling, as in how is the generation sector evolving? Yes. Yeah, so that's the whole study that we're going out for review with shortly to our TRC and some others, and so that we expect to have out in the next few months. And I guess the short answer is it all depends on what you assume about the future in terms of policies and fuel prices. But we will have sort of a reference case there, as well as some other sensitivities to those assumptions. I think it's safe to say that across the board here, the power sector is expecting to see growth in gas generation and growth in wind and solar in generation, and some growth in storage as well. That's kind of being seen across the board from multiple institutions, EIA, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, us, EPRI, et cetera. But then there's some key questions about how much of the different things, and those are really what's being driven by those other sensitivities.
Great, great. Well, Daniel, thanks to you. Thanks to NREL for having you out, and great for joining us, everybody. Have a great rest of your week. Take care.